Good evening. There is an amber bottle on a polished wooden shelf in a London pharmacy, and the year is 1895, and nobody is afraid of it. A mother lifts it down and pays for it without a second thought. A physician has prescribed it for a businessman's fraying nerves. Across the Atlantic, in the pharmacies of New York and Boston and Chicago, the same bottle sits between aspirin and cough syrup, unremarkable and entirely ordinary. Queen Victoria herself has taken measured doses of this same medicine, overseen by her personal physician, to quiet the pain that visits her once a month. It is safe. It is ancient. It is simply called cannabis, and it has been healing human beings for longer than most civilizations have existed. Now hold that image, that quiet shelf, that amber bottle, and then let it shatter. Because barely 30 years later, our federal agents are kicking down doors in the middle of the night. Helicopters are sweeping low over burning fields. Men are being dragged from their homes in handcuffs. Not for violence, not for theft, but for possessing the dried flowers of the exact same plant that once sat on that pharmacy shelf. Millions of human lives will be swallowed by concrete and steel. Families will be erased, entire neighborhoods hollowed out. And the machine that does all of this will be built not on science, not on medicine, not even on honest fear, but on something far older and far more corrosive. It will be built on a lie, on racism, on one man's desperate need to justify his budget. The plant did not change. Its chemistry did not mutate. Its ancient properties, the ones that soothed Queen Victoria, that healed wounded soldiers, as that accompanied the very first farmers as they broke open the earth, those properties remained exactly as they had always been. What changed was the story. And tonight, we are going to follow that story from its beginning, from the wind-swept plateaus of Central Asia, 12,000 years ago, all the way to the courtrooms and dispensaries and prison cells of the modern world. We are going to meet the men who loved this plant, the men who feared it, and the one man who decided to make the whole world afraid of something that had never deserved that fear. Before we continue, if these quiet journeys into the forgotten corners of history help you rest, consider leaving a like and subscribing before you close your eyes tonight. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. These things matter more than you know. But for now, dim the lights a little more. Let the night settle around you, and let us begin at the very beginning. There is a place in Central Asia, high, cold, and remote, where the wind comes down from the mountains with a kind of indifference that feels almost deliberate, as if the land itself has decided that human concerns are not its problem. This is the Altai region, a vast crumple of steppe and mountain that stretches across what is now Mongolia, Russia, Kazakhstan, and China. The summers here are brief and brutal in their brightness. The winters are something else entirely. And it was here, or somewhere very close to here, that the story begins. Not with a discovery exactly, more like a slow recognition between a species and a plant. A quiet agreement made over generations, not in the way that all the deepest agreements between humans and the natural world are made. Without ceremony, without drama, simply through the accumulation of daily use. Cannabis was first attested here, near the Altai Mountains, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 12,000 years ago. The evidence is not dramatic, it is archaeological. hemp fibers pressed into Neolithic pottery, seeds discovered at ancient burial sites, the cellular memory of a plant that decided long before we thought to encourage it, to grow close to where humans lived. Hemp is opportunistic in that way. It likes disturbed soil, the kind that forms around settlements, around hearths, around the churned earth at the edges of a camp. It grew where we were, and we noticed. What the earliest human beings noticed first was not the medicine. It was not the ceremony. It was something far more immediate and practical. The fiber. The stalks of the cannabis plant, when stripped and processed, a labor-intensive task, but one that rewards patience, produce one of the strongest natural fibers known to exist on this earth. In a world where survival depended on the integrity of every rope, every net, every garment, this mattered enormously. Hemp fiber does not rot easily. It does not weaken in moisture the way other natural fibers do. It can bear enormous weight without breaking. For the first farmers of the Neolithic age, those quiet revolutionaries who had decided sometime around 10,000 years ago to stop following the herds and start shaping the land instead, hemp was not a luxury. It was infrastructure. It clothed bodies. It became the rope that bound bundles of grain. It would eventually become the sail that caught the wind and moved the first trading boats across water. Thousands of years before anyone thought of it as medicine or ritual or recreation, cannabis was simply one of the most useful things a human being could grow. And so they grew it, carefully, deliberately. Across the long corridors of time, they carried its seeds with them as they moved, pressed the oil from its seeds for food and lamp fuel, and wove its fibers into the fabric of daily life. The earliest hard evidence of cannabis cultivation comes from the Yangshao culture of ancient China, farming communities that settled along the Wei and Yellow rivers, the great cradles of Chinese civilization somewhere around 5,000 years ago. These were not primitive people. They were meticulous farmers with a sophisticated understanding of the land they worked, and among the crops they cultivated alongside millet and soybeans and rice was hemp. Pottery fragments from their settlements bear the pressed imprints of hemp rope, a quiet record of a plant woven quite literally into the texture of early civilization. The ancient Chinese name for hemp was ma, a single syllable, and it carried within it a kind of gravity, because in classical Chinese, ma also came to carry a secondary meaning: numbness, senselessness, the awareness that this plant, properly administered, could reach into the body and quiet what was loud. The awareness, in other words, that it was medicine. This was not discovered all at once. It was observed over years, over generations, by people who watched carefully and remembered what they saw. Ancient Chinese physicians were empiricists long before the West developed the concept. They observed the natural world with rigorous attention, recorded what worked, and passed that knowledge forward. And what they observed about cannabis was this: its seeds were nutritious and could be pressed for oil. Its fibers were unmatched for rope and cloth. Its flowers, when prepared correctly, could relieve pain. Its smoke could alter the mind in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes not. The warning in one of the earliest pharmacological texts was careful and precise. Excessive use causes a person to see ghosts and walk about frenetically. That is not the language of moral panic. It is the language of clinical observation. The figure most associated with the earliest recorded medical use of cannabis in China is the legendary Emperor Shen Nung, a name that translates roughly, as the divine farmer. He is often described as the father of Chinese agriculture and medicine both, a mythological figure who, the stories say, tasted hundreds of plants himself in order to understand their properties and catalogued what he found. Tradition holds that around 2737 BCE, he prescribed cannabis for conditions including gout, rheumatism, and the pain that attends old age. Whether Shen Nung was a historical figure or a mythological construct matters less than what his existence tells us, that the Chinese medical tradition felt so naturally connected to cannabis that it wove the plant into the story of its own origins. On by the time of the Han Dynasty, 2000 years before the birth of Christ, cannabis was firmly embedded in the formal structure of Chinese medicine. It was listed among the 50 fundamental herbs of traditional practice, a canon developed over centuries of careful clinical observation. Every part of the plant had a use. The seeds were prescribed for constipation and for the pain of postpartum recovery. The leaves were used in preparations for tapeworm. The flowers, dried and prepared, were administered for the pain of menstruation and the fog of malaria. The root, in certain preparations, was used to address blood clots. A physician of the Han Dynasty, encountering a patient, did not think of cannabis as unusual or dangerous or requiring special justification. It was simply one of the tools of the trade. It's as ordinary as acupuncture needles, as accepted as the use of ginger for nausea. And then there is Hua Tuo, a surgeon of the 2nd century of the Common Era, who, the historical record tells us, developed something extraordinary. He reduced cannabis to a powder, mixed it with wine, and administered it to his patients before performing surgery. The procedure would produce, he noted, a state of insensibility in which the patient felt no pain. The Chinese term that evolved from this practice, ma zui, became the standard word for anesthesia in the Chinese language. It translates, quite precisely, as cannabis intoxication. The word for the mercy of not feeling pain in the oldest continuous medical tradition on earth was named after this plant. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Beyond China's borders, cannabis was making its own quiet journey across the ancient world. Carried by nomadic peoples whose movement across the steppe grasslands was the original globalization long before the word existed. The Scythians were among the most important of these carriers. They were a confederation of nomadic horsemen, fierce, mobile, and deeply sophisticated in ways that the sedentary civilizations to their south often failed to understand, who dominated the steppes, stretching from the Black Sea all the way to the borders of China, between roughly the 9th and 4th centuries BCE. They lived on their horses, and they moved with the seasons, and they carried cannabis with them across enormous distances, both as a practical resource and as a ritual one. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described their use of cannabis in a way that has the precision of an eyewitness account, or at least the account of someone who had spoken to eyewitnesses. He described how the Scythians, following the burial of a king, would construct small felt-draped chambers, heat stones within them until they glowed, and throw cannabis seeds upon the stones. The smoke that rose would fill the chamber. The mourners inside would cry out in what Herodotus described simply as joy or delight, a word that carries within it no judgment, no censure, just observation. These people were grieving, and they used the plant to help them grieve. It was ceremony. It was the pharmacology of loss. Archaeologists excavating Scythian burial sites across the Russian steppe and in the Altai Mountains have found exactly what Herodotus described. Small bronze censers and braziers designed for heating stones, hemp seeds scattered among the burial goods. The archaeology confirms the history. The Scythians moved cannabis westward into Europe and eastward into China, threading the plant through the networks of the ancient world the way a river threads through a landscape, quietly, persistently, finding every available channel. In ancient Egypt, cannabis appears in medical papyri that date back as far as 1700 BCE, the Ramesseum Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence, references preparations involving hemp. Egyptian physicians used it in suppositories to relieve the pain of hemorrhoids, in topical preparations to ease the swelling of inflamed eyes. The Berlin Papyrus, dated to around 1300 BCE, contains additional references. The Chester Beatty Medical Papyrus, from the same era, adds more. These are not marginal or fringe documents. They are the formal medical records of one of the greatest civilizations in human history, and in them, cannabis is simply a medicine, listed without shame, administered without hesitation. In ancient India, cannabis occupied an even more profound position. In the texts of Ayurvedic medicine, a medical tradition so old that its origins are genuinely difficult to date, with some scholars placing its foundations as far back as 3000 BCE, cannabis appears as a treatment for pain, for anxiety, for the difficulty of sleep, and for the management of conditions involving spasm and inflammation. But it was not only medicine. In ancient India, cannabis was threaded through the fabric of religious practice, associated with the god Shiva, consumed during festivals, prepared as a drink called bhang that mixed the plant with milk and spices. It was simultaneously a healing tool and a sacrament, and the Indian tradition did not see these two things as contradictory. The body and the spirit were not separate concerns. And in ancient Greece and Rome, cannabis appears in the writing of the physicians and naturalists who formed the foundation of Western medicine. Dioscorides, the Greek physician whose encyclopedia of medicinal plants would be consulted by European doctors for 15 centuries after his death, described cannabis and its medical applications in careful detail. Pliny the Elder, who compiled a natural history of the ancient world so comprehensive that it remained a standard reference for over 1,000 years, wrote of hemp's properties. Galen, and the physician whose influence on European medicine was so immense that his teachings were still considered authoritative in the 17th century of the Common Era, prescribed cannabis for his patients. The plant crossed civilizations. It crossed millennia. It moved along the Silk Road with merchants and diplomats, along sea lanes with traders, along migration routes with the peoples of the ancient world. Wherever human beings settled and built something worth tending, cannabis arrived, found a place in the garden, and made itself useful. And through all of this, through 10,000 years of cultivation, trade, medicine, and ceremony, no government declared it an enemy. No king issued an edict demanding its destruction. No moral authority pronounced it a danger to the fabric of society. For the overwhelming majority of human history, cannabis was simply part of the world, as unremarkable and as indispensable as wheat, as ordinary and as quietly essential as the rope that bound civilization together. That ordinariness would not last, but its loss was not inevitable, and it was not scientific. It was chosen by specific people in specific rooms for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the plant itself. But that story belongs to another part of this night. For now, it is enough to sit with the weight of what we have just traced. 10,000 years of partnership between this plant and our species, long before the word pharmacy existed, long before the word crime existed, long before the machinery of the modern state had been built to decide what was permissible and what was not. Human beings were growing cannabis in their gardens, pressing its seeds for oil, or weaving its fibers into cloth and administering its medicine to the sick. They knew something. And for a very long time, the world was wise enough to let them know it. There is a young Irish physician standing on a dock in Calcutta in the winter of 1833, and he is watching a city he does not yet understand. His name is William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. He is 24 years old, recently graduated from the Edinburgh Medical School, and he has arrived in India as an assistant surgeon with the British East India Company, a posting that would, in the ordinary course of things, involve treating British soldiers for dysentery and malaria, writing reports, and returning home after a suitable number of years with a modest reputation and a modest pension. That is what was supposed to happen. What actually happened was that O'Shaughnessy became curious. He was the kind of man who could not encounter something unfamiliar without needing to understand it completely. And India in the 1830s was full of things that European medicine had not yet thought to examine. Among them was a practice he observed among Indian physicians, Ayurvedic practitioners whose tradition stretched back thousands of years before the discipline O'Shaughnessy had been trained in even existed, of administering preparations made from cannabis to patients suffering from pain, from muscle spasm, from the convulsions of tetanus, from the misery of rheumatism. He watched. He asked questions, he read what the ancient texts said, and then, with the methodical patience that distinguished the best physicians of his era, he began to test what he had observed. He administered cannabis preparations to animals first, carefully documenting the effects, the doses, the outcomes. Satisfied that the plant would not kill indiscriminately, he moved to human patients. He treated a 40-day-old infant suffering from violent convulsions, a child who had already been given up as likely to die. With a tincture of cannabis resin dissolved in alcohol, the convulsions ceased. The child lived. He treated patients in the grip of tetanus, a condition for which the medicine of 1839 had no reliable remedy, and found that cannabis preparations brought a degree of relief that nothing else in his pharmacopoeia could match. He treated patients with rheumatism, with cholera, with the specific agony of muscle spasm, and he documented with the precision of a man who understood that his findings would be scrutinized, every result. In 1839, he published his findings in the Transactions of the Medical and Physical Society of Bengal. The paper ran to 40 pages. It was thorough, careful, and almost immediately noticed by physicians in Britain and the United States. What O'Shaughnessy had done, in essence, was build a formal bridge between the ancient medical knowledge of India, knowledge that had been accumulating and refining itself for over 3,000 years, and the evidence-based framework of Victorian Western medicine. He had taken what the ancient world already knew and translated it into the language that the modern world required in order to believe it. That paper changed everything. By the 1840s, cannabis tinctures were appearing in British pharmacies, with the quiet confidence of a product whose time had come. By the 1850s, They had crossed the Atlantic. By the middle of the 19th century, cannabis preparations were being manufactured by the most reputable pharmaceutical companies in the English-speaking world: Merck, Squibb, Eli Lilly, Park Davis, and sold across the counters of pharmacies in every major city in Britain and America. There were, before the year 1937, more than 2,000 distinct cannabis-based medicines on the market, produced by more than 280 manufacturers. 2,000 medicines. That number is not an abstraction. It represents a medical community that had examined this plant, tested it, refined preparations from it, found it useful in a wide range of conditions, and incorporated it fully into the standard of care. It represents doctors prescribing it for migraine, for insomnia, for the pain of labor, for the convulsions of epilepsy, and for the inflammation of arthritis, for the cramps of menstruation, for the anxiety that attends modern life in a rapidly industrializing world. It represents the amber bottle on the pharmacy shelf in London, 1895, ordinary, unremarkable, exactly as it should be. Cannabis was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official compendium of accepted medicines, the definitive reference used by physicians and pharmacists across the country from 1851 onwards. This was not a fringe endorsement. The Pharmacopoeia represented the considered consensus of the American medical establishment, compiled by the most qualified physicians in the country after careful review of available evidence. Its inclusion of cannabis was not a mistake or an oversight. It was a deliberate recognition that this plant had earned its place at the table of legitimate medicine. And the patients who benefited from it were not criminals or curiosities or moral failures. They were ordinary people with ordinary suffering, and the medicine helped them. Among those ordinary people was a woman whose position made her anything but ordinary. Queen Victoria was, by the 1880s, a woman in considerable pain. The accumulated losses of her long reign. Her husband Albert dead since 1861. Her health never entirely robust. The physical demands of a body that had borne 9 children had left her susceptible to the severe menstrual cramping that visited her with predictable cruelty every month. She was, by all accounts, not a patient woman where suffering was concerned. She wanted relief, and she wanted it to be reliable. To her personal physician, appointed in 1878, was a man named Sir John Russell Reynolds, one of the most distinguished neurologists in Britain, a Fellow of the Royal Society, a physician whose reputation for rigorous thinking was impeccable. Reynolds was not a man given to fashionable remedies or wishful thinking. He was a careful empiricist who based his practice on what he could observe, and what he had observed over more than 30 years of clinical practice was that cannabis, properly prepared, carefully dosed, was one of the most effective remedies available for precisely the kind of pain that afflicted the Queen. He prescribed it. She took it. And in 1890, Reynolds published in The Lancet, then as now one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, a summary of more than 3 decades of clinical experience with cannabis. His conclusion was measured and precise in the way that only a man of genuine confidence can be measured. He described cannabis as valuable in the treatment of painful menstruation, of senile insomnia, of certain neuralgic conditions, of specific forms of migraine and spasm. He was not evangelizing. He was reporting what he had seen, what any careful doctor who had spent 30 years watching this plant work could not avoid seeing. Reynolds did note one significant limitation. a limitation that would, in hindsight, foreshadow the difficulties that lay ahead. The active ingredient in cannabis had not yet been isolated, and the structure of THC would not be determined until 1964 by the Israeli scientist Raphael Mikulam. And so in Reynolds's era, every preparation of cannabis was of uncertain potency. The hemp grown in different seasons, in different places, he wrote, varied in the amount of therapeutic agent it contained. This made reliable dosing difficult. The same preparation that brought a patient quiet relief one month might produce disorientation the next, depending on the particular batch of plant material from which it had been made. This was not a condemnation of the medicine. It was a challenge to manufacturing consistency, the kind of challenge that pharmacology had solved for other plant-derived medicines, and would, in time, solve for this one too. Except that time was not given, and the late 19th century was a period of extraordinary confidence in the Western medical tradition. New tools were arriving with the rhythm of a tide coming in. The germ theory of disease, the development of antiseptic technique, the beginning of what would become the modern pharmaceutical industry. And the cannabis preparations on pharmacy shelves were part of this expanding pharmacopoeia. Not a relic of folk medicine, but an accepted and legitimate tool, reviewed, endorsed, and in daily clinical use. It is worth pausing here in the warmth of this particular moment and recognizing what it meant. A mother in Boston with a child suffering from convulsions could walk into a pharmacy and come home with a cannabis tincture prescribed by a physician and manufactured to a standard, and sit with her child through the night while the medicine worked. A laborer in Manchester with hands destroyed by rheumatism could find relief. A woman enduring the pain of difficult labor could receive a cannabis preparation and know a few hours of relative ease. These were not extraordinary people seeking extraordinary remedies. These were ordinary human beings in ordinary pain, finding ordinary help, and none of it, not a single part of it, required the destruction of a life. Not a single arrest, not a single prison sentence, not a single family, separated and swallowed by the machinery of the state. The medicine existed. It worked, imperfectly but genuinely, as all medicines do, and the world was better for its existence. But even as the amber bottles lined the pharmacy shelves, and forces were gathering in the shadows of the new century that would overturn everything, the first intimations were subtle. In the American Southwest, in the border states, something had been happening for decades that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with fear. Waves of Mexican immigrants displaced by revolution and poverty had been crossing into the United States since the early years of the 1900s, bringing with them their own cultural relationship with cannabis, a relationship that was recreational and social rather than strictly medical. In Mexico, cannabis had a long popular history of use among working-class communities. It was smoked. It was called by various Spanish names, among them marijuana. The word itself was new to American ears, and newness in a climate of economic anxiety and racial hostility was not welcome. In the states of the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Louisiana, local newspapers began running stories. The stories had a particular shape. They described Mexican men, inflamed by marijuana, committing acts of violence. They described the drug as producing a kind of madness in those who consumed it, a particular savage madness that seemed, in the telling, always to afflict the darker-skinned. The word marijuana appeared in these stories with deliberate regularity. Not cannabis, not hemp, not the familiar medically respectable name under which the drug had been prescribed and administered for decades. Marijuana. The foreign name, the alien name, the name that carried within it the sound of somewhere else. This was not accidental, and it was not yet federal policy. It was still local noise, the rumble of a machine not yet fully assembled. But the machine was being built, quietly in the background of a country lurching through economic depression and profound anxiety about its own identity. The components were being gathered, the ideology was being hammered into shape, and the man who would assemble it into something coherent and devastating was not yet fully committed to his task. He was sitting in an office in Washington, D.C., watching his budget shrink and thinking very carefully about the future. His name was Harry Anslinger, and the world he was about to make would bear almost no resemblance to the one in which Queen Victoria's physician had quietly, carefully written his conclusions in the Lancet. That ancient medicine, the one that Emperor Shen Nung prescribed nearly 5,000 years ago, the one that healed convulsing children and soothed arthritic hands, the one that had accompanied the whole long human journey from the first farms of the Neolithic to the polished shelves of the Victorian pharmacy, was about to be given a new name, a new face, a new meaning, and none of it would be true. Harry Jacob Anslinger was born in 1892 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, the son of a Swiss immigrant barber, and he grew up with the particular hunger of a man who has decided, early and irrevocably, that he will matter. He was not a scientist. He was not a physician. He had no training in pharmacology, no background in public health, no academic grounding in the nature of the substances he would spend his life legislating against. What he had was ambition, the cold, disciplined, bureaucratic kind that does not announce itself loudly, but moves through institutions the way water moves through stone, patiently, persistently, finding every available weakness and pressing into it until something gives. By 1930, at the age of 38, Anslinger had navigated his way to the top of a newly created federal agency, the Treasury Department's Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He had been appointed by his uncle-in-law, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon, a connection he would never publicly emphasize, and which his supporters would spend decades downplaying. He arrived at his desk with a budget of $100,000 and a mandate to address the nation's drug problem. The problem, at that moment, was understood primarily as heroin and cocaine, substances that had been restricted under the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 and were used, federal estimates suggested, by a relatively small segment of the population. A small segment of the population meant a small justification for a large bureau. In the early years of his tenure, Anslinger was on record dismissing the idea that cannabis posed any serious threat. He called the notion that it caused violence or madness an absurd fallacy. He said this clearly, in writing, in correspondence, and public statements. He understood, because he was intelligent enough to understand, that the available medical and scientific consensus did not support the claim that cannabis was a dangerous drug, in the way that heroin and cocaine were dangerous drugs. And then the Great Depression arrived, and the federal budget began to shrink, and the men in Washington started asking hard questions about which agencies were truly necessary. And Anslinger looked at his shrinking appropriations and his exposed bureaucratic position, and he reconsidered. He reconsidered everything. The pivot, when it came, was not gradual. It was strategic. Anslinger did not slowly change his mind about cannabis the way a scientist changes their mind when confronted with new evidence, carefully, reluctantly, following the data wherever it leads. He changed his mind the way a politician changes a talking point, completely, immediately, and with the conviction of a man who has decided that the new position is the one that serves his interests. By 1934, cannabis had become the centerpiece of his bureau's public mission, not because the evidence had changed, not because a new study had emerged, not because the medical community had raised an alarm, but because cannabis was everywhere, grown in fields across the country, used casually in ways that were difficult to quantify, associated with communities that the American mainstream already regarded with suspicion. It was, in the language of bureaucratic opportunity, a target-rich environment, and Anslinger understood something else, something that would prove to be the most devastating insight of his career. He understood that the name of the thing mattered as much as the thing itself. The word cannabis was familiar. It was the word on the amber bottles in the pharmacy. It was the word in Reynolds' Lancet paper. It was the word in the United States Pharmacopoeia, in the American Medical Association's literature, in the formal vocabulary of medicine that stretched back through centuries of legitimate practice. Cannabis was not frightening. Cannabis was medicine. Cannabis was the prescription that had soothed Queen Victoria and healed convulsing children and accompanied the whole long story of human civilization from its earliest chapters. Marijuana was different. Marijuana, or marijuana as Anslinger preferred to spell it, leaning into the Spanish orthography, was a word that most American physicians had never encountered professionally. It was a street term, a Mexican term, a term that carried within its syllables the sound of the border, of the foreign, of the other. When Anslinger and his bureau began, in the mid-1930s, to systematically replace the word cannabis with the word marijuana in all of their public communications, congressional testimony, press releases, and propaganda materials, they were not making a linguistic choice. They were making a racial one. They were taking a medicine that Americans trusted, that had sat on pharmacy shelves and been prescribed by the most distinguished physicians in the English-speaking world, and they were disguising it, giving it a new face, a darker face, the face of the immigrant, the transient, and the man the American mainstream had already been taught to fear. The word marijuana, in Anslinger's hands, became a weapon. What he needed to make the weapon effective was stories. He was not going to get them from the scientific literature. He knew this because he had already tried. In the mid-1930s, Anslinger consulted with 30 prominent physicians, asking them to confirm his emerging claim that cannabis caused violent behavior, psychosis, and moral degeneracy. 29 of them told him, with the measured patience of people explaining something to someone who does not want to hear it, that the evidence did not support this conclusion. That cannabis was a legitimate medicine with a long and well-documented history of safe use. That the link between cannabis and violence was not established by any credible study. One doctor agreed with him. Anslinger took that one doctor's letter to Congress. The rest of his evidence came from what he called the Gore files, a collection he assembled over years, drawing from newspaper clippings, local police reports, letters from sheriffs in rural counties, and the sensationalist press of the Hearst newspaper chain, whose owner, William Randolph Hearst, had his own financial reasons for wanting hemp production suppressed, and his own long history of publishing material designed to inflame racial anxiety. The Gore files contained accounts of murders, rapes, and acts of violence that Anslinger attributed to marijuana use. 200 such cases assembled into a dossier that was presented to Congress and the American public as evidence of a crisis. Victor Licata was the most prominent name in the Gore files. In 1933, a young man named Victor Licata killed his family with an axe in Tampa, Florida. The local press, following the logic of the moment, attributed the act to marijuana. The story was vivid and horrifying in the way that only family violence can be vivid and horrifying. And Anslinger seized on it with the precision of a man who understood exactly what the story could do for him. He told it in congressional hearings. He told it to newspaper editors. He told it in radio addresses. Victor Licata became the face of marijuana, the proof that this foreign substance transformed ordinary young men into something unrecognizable and monstrous. What Anslinger did not mention, what he knew because the records existed and were not hidden, was that Victor Licata had been diagnosed with severe mental illness years before the murders. The county records showed that local officials had sought to have him committed to a psychiatric institution well before the night his family died. There was no reliable evidence that he had ever used cannabis. The psychiatrists who reviewed his case identified his psychosis as entirely unrelated to any substance. The axe murder was not a marijuana story. It was a mental illness story, wrapped in marijuana's name by a man who needed it to be something else. That is worth sitting with for a moment. A family was destroyed. A young man lost to illness that should have been treated, not ignored. And the primary legacy of that tragedy, as engineered by Harry Anslinger, was not better psychiatric care or earlier intervention or more compassionate treatment of the mentally ill. It was a propaganda campaign that would imprison millions. Neither propaganda campaign had a cultural arm, and it was cinema. The mid-1930s produced a cluster of films designed to make the American public afraid of cannabis in the way that only moving pictures in that era could make a population afraid of something. The most famous of these, the one that would eventually lend its name to the entire era of cannabis hysteria, was originally titled Tell Your Children. It was released in 1936, directed by a man named Louis J. Quesnier, and it depicted, in the melodramatic register of the time, a group of young people who smoke marijuana and subsequently descend into violence, sexual depravity, madness, and murder. The film was not subtle. It was not interested in subtlety. It was interested in terror and in the manufacture of a specific and vivid image, the marijuana cigarette as the first step on a staircase that ends at the absolute bottom of human experience. The film was later renamed Reefer Madness, and the name stuck, not as the film's makers intended, as a warning, but eventually, decades later, as a label for the entire fraudulent enterprise. Reefer Madness. The madness was real. It was just not the madness they had advertised. Anslinger wrote articles for popular magazines, including a piece for the American magazine in 1937 titled Assassin of Youth, that described cannabis in language calibrated precisely to provoke maximum fear. He described it as producing in its users a state of incalculable unpredictability. A person who placed a marijuana cigarette to their lips could not know, he wrote, whether they would become a philosopher or a murderer. The choice of those two poles, philosopher or murderer, was not accidental. It framed the cannabis user as someone who had surrendered all self-determination, all rationality, all the qualities that distinguished the civilized person from the savage. And beneath the philosophy and the murder, running through every article and every speech and every gore file case, was the racial subtext that was never quite stated directly, but was never far from the surface. Anslinger wrote of Negroes and Hispanics and Filipinos and their satanic music. He wrote of white women seeking relations with men of other races under the influence of the drug. He used, in internal correspondence, a language so casually vicious that it prompted a demand for his removal from a Pennsylvania senator who saw one of his letters. He survived it. He always survived. He was, in his way, very good at what he did. What he did was make people afraid of a word, and through the word, of the people associated with it. In April 1937, a congressman from North Carolina introduced House Bill 6385, legislation that would, through the mechanism of a prohibitive tax, effectively make the possession and sale of cannabis illegal across the United States. The Marijuana Tax Act. The hearings that preceded its passage were brief, and they were almost entirely one-sided. Anslinger testified. He brought his gore files. He brought his one cooperative doctor. He did not bring the 29 who had disagreed, and no one asked him why. One organization did send a representative to object. The American Medical Association, the body that represented the physicians who had been prescribing cannabis for nearly a century, whose members' patients were currently receiving it in tinctures and preparations from pharmacies across the country, sent its legislative counsel, a physician named Dr. William C. Woodward, to testify against the bill. Woodward's testimony was measured and specific and based entirely on evidence. He pointed out that the AMA had not been consulted during the bill's preparation. He noted that the term marijuana was unfamiliar to most physicians precisely because it was not the term used in medical literature, that the deliberate use of this street name had obscured the fact that the bill was targeting cannabis, in a medicine with a long and legitimate history of clinical use. He argued that the proposed legislation would cut off medical research into a substance that had demonstrated genuine therapeutic value. He asked the committee to consider what it was actually doing in the name of what it claimed to be addressing. The committee chairman told him, in essence, to sit down. The bill passed the House Ways and Means Committee after 90 seconds of consideration. On August 2, 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act became law. On August 2, 1937, the same day, a man named Samuel Caldwell became the first person arrested under the new legislation in Denver, Colorado, for selling 2 marijuana cigarettes. He was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. He was 58 years old. He had sold 2 cigarettes. He would not survive his sentence in good health. He emerged broken, and he died a year after his release. This was the beginning. The amber bottle on the pharmacy shelf had been there for centuries. In one form or another, under one name or another, in pharmacies in London and Beijing and Alexandria and Delhi. The medicine inside it had been prescribed by Emperor Shen Nung 4,600 years before Samuel Caldwell was born. It had been documented by Herodotus, tested by O'Shaughnessy, administered to Queen Victoria, defended by the American Medical Association. None of it mattered on the morning of August 2nd, 1937. What mattered was a word, a foreign word, a word that had been chosen for precisely its foreignness, shaped by a man who needed a villain and found one in a plant that had done nothing but heal. As the machine was built, the lie was law, and the cost, the full, catastrophic, multi-generational cost of what had been set in motion, was only beginning to reveal itself. Richard Nixon stood before the cameras on June 17, 1971, and announced that America had a new enemy. He did not describe it in the cautious language of policy. He did not speak of public health approaches or treatment programs, or the careful weighing of evidence that responsible governance requires. He used the language of war, direct, absolute, and final. Drug abuse, he said, was public enemy number one. He was declaring, with all the weight of the American presidency behind it, a war on drugs. And in the months and years that followed, and the machinery of that war was assembled with the thoroughness that only the resources of the world's most powerful government can bring to a project it has decided to pursue without restraint. The machinery needed targets, and the targets, as they had been since Harry Anslinger first looked at his shrinking budget in 1934 and made his calculation, were not chosen at random. We know this not because of inference or implication or the retrospective analysis of historians, important as that analysis is. We know it because one of the men who built the machine eventually said so, out loud, in plain language, to a journalist who was interviewing him for a book. His name was John Ehrlichman. He had served as Richard Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, one of the men closest to the center of the administration, and one of the architects of its priorities and its methods. He was later convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice in the Watergate scandal and served 18 months in federal prison. And it is possible that the experience of being on the receiving end of the machine he had helped to build gave him a certain clarity. In a 1994 interview with journalist Dan Baum, an interview whose contents were not published until 2016, by which point Ehrlichman had been dead for 15 years. He said what the evidence had long suggested, but what no one inside the administration had ever been willing to say directly. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that, he told Baum, had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. And then he said the thing that, once said, cannot be unsaid. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Of course we did. Sit with that for a moment. Let its weight settle. The war on drugs, the policy framework that would, over the following 5 decades, consume trillions of dollars, destroy millions of lives, and reshape the social fabric of the most powerful nation on earth, was built on a foundation that its own architects knew to be false. They knew the association between cannabis and violence was manufactured. They knew the racial targeting was intentional. They knew the public justification bore no relationship to the actual motivation, and they built it anyway, because it worked, because the political benefits of being able to arrest your enemies without the inconvenience of charging them with the actual crime of being your enemies, that benefit was too useful to forgo. This was not Anslinger's lie, dressed in new clothes. It was an extension of it. an escalation of the same essential architecture that had been built in the 1930s. The names had changed. The political context had changed. The scale of the machinery had expanded enormously. But the core logic was identical. Identify a substance associated with people you wish to suppress, criminalize the substance, and proceed. It is important to say that historians have noted the complexity of Nixon's drug policy, that it was not solely or even primarily a punitive program in its earliest form, that it included treatment and rehabilitation components that later administrations would strip away, that Ehrlichman's admission should be understood in the context of a bitter man speaking long after the fact about events that may have been more complicated in the living than in the telling. All of this is true. History is rarely clean, but the outcomes are not complicated. The outcomes are documented, and they are devastating, and they speak for themselves with a clarity that no qualification can fully muffle. In 1971, when Nixon declared his war, there were approximately 300,000 people incarcerated in American jails and prisons. By the time the war had been running for 30 years, shaped by Nixon's initial declaration, accelerated by Reagan's escalation in the 1980s, deepened by mandatory minimum sentencing laws, three strikes provisions, and the specific savagery of crack cocaine sentencing guidelines that punished possession of crack at a ratio 100 times harsher than powder cocaine. That number had grown to 2.3 million. 2.3 million human beings. The United States, by the end of the 20th century, had the largest incarcerated population on Earth, not per capita, in absolute terms. The country that described itself as the land of the free imprisoned more of its people in raw numbers than any other nation in the history of the world. And the drug war was the engine of that growth. Half of all federal prisoners were incarcerated for drug offenses. 2/3 of those imprisoned for drug offenses were people of color. The racial disparity that Anslinger had built into the system's foundation in 1937 had not been an accident of enforcement. It had been amplified, institutionalized, and made more efficient with each passing decade. Black men were arrested for cannabis at rates 6 times higher than white men, and despite study after study confirming that white and black Americans used cannabis at virtually identical rates. The drug was the same, the behavior was the same, the outcomes were not the same. They had never been designed to be the same. In California, researchers found that African Americans were 10 times more likely than other racial groups to be imprisoned for cannabis offenses. 10 times. Not for using more, not for selling more, simply for being who they were in a system designed from the beginning to see them differently. Entire neighborhoods were systematically hollowed out. Fathers disappeared into the prison system for years, sometimes for decades, on charges that in a different zip code, in a different tax bracket, in a different skin, would have drawn a fine and a court-mandated education program. Children grew up without parents. Partners lost partners. Communities lost the people who held them together. The economic consequences compounded over generations. A criminal record makes employment harder, housing harder, education harder, voting in many states impossible. The debt was not paid at sentencing. It accumulated across a lifetime and across lifetimes. This was not a side effect of the policy. This was the policy. Ehrlichman said so. Ronald Reagan arrived at the presidency in 1981 and found the machinery that Nixon had built and decided that it was not running nearly fast enough. The Reagan years transformed the war on drugs from a political framework into a cultural crusade, the kind of campaign that requires not just law enforcement, but moral fervor, the participation of schools and media and churches and neighbors, the internalization by an entire society of the belief that drug use was not a public health problem, but a moral failure, not a symptom of poverty and despair, but the cause of it. Just say no. 3 words. Simple enough for a bumper sticker, simple enough for a president's wife to campaign on. Simple enough to reduce decades of complex social research into a piece of advice so devoid of actual utility that it served primarily as a mechanism for blaming the suffering for their suffering. The mandatory minimum sentencing laws that proliferated through the 1980s and into the 1990s tied the hands of judges who might otherwise have exercised discretion, who might have looked at a young man with a minor cannabis charge and seen a person worth not destroying. The laws removed that option. 5 grams of crack cocaine, 5 years, mandatory, and the same weight of powder cocaine, the drug of the wealthy and the white. No mandatory minimum. The disparity was not accidental. It was legislated. It was written into the law with the precision of people who understood exactly what they were writing. 3 strikes laws arrived next. Provisions that imposed life sentences on individuals convicted of a 3rd felony, regardless of the nature of that felony, regardless of whether anyone had been harmed, regardless of what the judge thought was just. People received life sentences for cannabis possession. Life. The duration of an entire human existence, measured against a dried plant that had been prescribed by Queen Victoria's physician a century earlier. No one called it justice. The people who built it called it consequences. There are individual lives inside these statistics, and it is important not to let the numbers obscure the people. There is a woman in Louisiana serving a life sentence imposed in the 1990s under a habitual offender statute for possession of cannabis, a sentence that the judge who imposed it described on the record as unjust, but that the law required him to impose regardless. She is still incarcerated. The laws under which she was sentenced have since been reformed. She has not been released. There are men who entered the prison system in their 20s and emerged, if they emerged, in their 50s, having missed the births of grandchildren, the deaths of parents, the entire middle chapter of a life that continued happening outside the walls without them. Men who learned to read in prison, men who forgot what it felt like to walk into a room without being watched. And there are children, so many children, who grew up understanding that the police were not a source of safety, but of sudden catastrophic loss, who learned early that the world operated by different rules for people who looked like them, who carried that understanding into adulthood and passed it inevitably to their own children. And there is Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday was the greatest jazz vocalist of her generation, possibly of any generation, a woman whose voice carried within it the entire weight of the African American experience in a country that had not yet decided to acknowledge that weight. Her relationship with drugs was complicated and deeply human, and she struggled with heroin addiction for years, an addiction that had its roots in the poverty and trauma of a childhood so brutal that it would require a long evening of its own to describe it fully. She needed help. What she received instead was Harry Anslinger. Anslinger had assigned a federal agent to follow Billie Holiday from the late 1930s onwards. He was not, as has sometimes been claimed, targeting her because of the political content of Strange Fruit, the song she recorded in 1939 that described the lynching of black men in the American South, with an imagery so unflinching that many radio stations refused to play it. His stated motivation was to use her as a high-profile drug case, a visible example of what narcotics did to even the most talented among the communities he had already decided were his primary targets. She was arrested. She was convicted. She lost her New York cabaret license, the license that allowed her to perform in the city's jazz clubs, the license without which a jazz singer in mid-century America had no career. She fought to have it reinstated. She performed concerts and recorded albums and continued, with the stubbornness of someone who has decided that they will not be erased, to do the work she was put on earth to do. And still, the federal agents followed her to the end. In 1959, Billie Holiday was dying in a hospital bed in New York, dying of cirrhosis of the liver, her body finally yielding to the accumulated damage of a life lived at the extreme limits of human endurance. Federal agents arrested her in her hospital bed. They handcuffed a dying woman to her bed frame and charged her with drug possession. And they posted a guard outside her door and revoked her right to receive flowers or visitors. She died there on July 17th, 1959, handcuffed to a hospital bed, with a federal agent standing outside her door. She was 44 years old. This is the cost. This is what the lie built, not in the abstract, not as a policy outcome or a statistical disparity or a line in a report about incarceration rates, but in the specific, irreducible weight of individual human lives. Samuel Caldwell, sentenced to 4 years of hard labor for 2 cigarettes. Billie Holiday, handcuffed in her deathbed. The woman in Louisiana, serving life for possession. The 2,300,000 people in American prisons, 2/3 of them people of color, imprisoned in numbers that no other country on earth has matched for a war that its own architects admitted, in plain language, was built on lies. The plant did not change. It was still the same plant that Shen Nung prescribed in 2000 or 737 BCE. Still the same plant that healed convulsing children and soothed arthritic hands and sat in amber bottles on pharmacy shelves in London and New York. Still the same plant whose chemistry had been understood by the Scythians, documented by Herodotus, tested by O'Shaughnessy, endorsed by the American Medical Association, prescribed to a queen. The plant had not changed at all. Everything else, the law, the language, the machinery of punishment, the manufactured fear, had been built around it by men who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. And in the meantime, while the arrests were happening, while the prison population was swelling, while the helicopters swept over burning fields and doors were kicked from their hinges in the middle of the night, something else was happening, quietly, in laboratories, in the bodies of the people being imprisoned. Something was being discovered, something that would, in time, make the whole structure of the lie even more difficult to sustain. In 1964, in a laboratory in Jerusalem, a chemist named Raphael Mekulam held in his hands something that no human being had ever held before. He had isolated, for the first time in the history of science, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. He had determined its precise molecular structure, the arrangement of its carbon and hydrogen and oxygen atoms, the exact geometry of the thing that made cannabis do what it did to the human mind and body. He named it tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, and the isolation of that molecule, the moment when the plant's most important component was finally rendered in the precise, unambiguous language of chemistry, should have been a watershed in the history of medicine. It should have opened a new era of rigorous, systematic research into a substance that had been in continuous medical use for 10,000 years, a substance whose clinical record stretched from the ancient pharmacopoeias of China and India all the way to the amber bottles of the Victorian pharmacy. It did not do that. Not immediately. Not for a very long time, because by 1964, cannabis was already well along the path toward its final legal destruction in the United States. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 had done its foundational damage. Cannabis had been removed from the United States pharmacopoeia in the years following that act, quietly deleted from the official compendium of legitimate medicines, its name struck from the list with the administrative finality of a bureaucrat who has been told that something no longer exists and has decided to make the paperwork agree. In 1961, the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs had placed cannabis under the strictest available control regime, Schedule 4, the category reserved for substances deemed to have no medical value and high potential for abuse. It shared that category with heroin. And in 1970, 6 years after McCollum held his isolated molecule in a Jerusalem laboratory, the United States government formally classified cannabis as a Schedule 1 controlled substance under the newly enacted Controlled Substances Act. Schedule 1 meant, in the language of the law, that the substance had no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Schedule 1 meant that researching cannabis required special federal authorization that was, in practice, extraordinarily difficult to obtain. Schedule 1 meant that the entire accumulated weight of 10,000 years of documented medical use had been officially declared by the government of the most powerful nation on earth not to exist. Raphael McCollum continued his research anyway, outside the United States, in Israel, where the regulatory environment was different, where the political machinery that had been built around cannabis in America had not been exported wholesale. He continued, and what he found over the following decades would eventually force even the most entrenched institutional positions to begin, slowly and with considerable reluctance, to move. The human body, it turns out, was built to receive this plant. That sentence sounds, on first encounter, like the kind of claim made by people who want it to be true and have decided to work backwards from the conclusion. It is not. It is a precise description of what McCollum and his colleagues discovered in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and it is one of the most remarkable findings in the history of neuroscience. Remarkable not because it is surprising, exactly, but because of what it implies about the relationship between our species and this plant, and about the nature of the suppression that had been visited upon that relationship for 50 years. In 1988, an American researcher named Alan Howlett identified the first cannabinoid receptor in the human brain. A receptor is a molecular structure, a kind of biological lock that exists on the surface of cells and is activated by specific chemical keys. The presence of a receptor for a particular compound tells you something important. It tells you that the body was, in some sense, expecting that compound, that it had prepared a place for it, that the interaction between the compound and the body was not an accident or an imposition, but something the body had, through the long process of evolution, anticipated and accommodated. And the receptor Howlett identified, later called CB1, was present not in small numbers, but in extraordinary abundance. It turned out to be one of the most widespread receptor types in the entire central nervous system, found in high concentrations in the regions of the brain associated with memory, with pain perception, with emotional regulation, with appetite, with the management of fear and stress. CB1 receptors were everywhere, and they were specifically shaped to receive the compounds produced by the cannabis plant. The question that immediately followed this discovery was the question that any scientist would ask. If these receptors exist to receive cannabis compounds, what are they doing the rest of the time? The body does not build elaborate molecular infrastructure for external substances, and the presence of these receptors implied that the body must be producing its own version of the keys, its own cannabinoid-like molecules that activated the same locks. McCollum found them. In 1992, he isolated the first endogenous cannabinoid, a molecule produced naturally within the human body that binds to the same receptors as THC. He named it anandamide, drawing from the Sanskrit word ananda, which means bliss or joy. The name was not chosen carelessly. It reflected the function. Anandamide plays a role in the regulation of mood, of pain, of appetite, of memory, of the body's response to stress. It is part of a system, the endocannabinoid system, that operates continuously throughout the human brain and body, maintaining a kind of biological equilibrium, a steady state of managed experience. The endocannabinoid system. The name did not exist before 1992. The system itself had been operating in the human body for tens of millions of years. Let us be precise about what this means. The human body contains a biological system, a network of receptors and naturally produced molecules that is designed to interact with the compounds found in cannabis. This system plays a role in regulating pain, in managing inflammation, in modulating mood and anxiety, in supporting healthy sleep, in mediating the body's response to stress and trauma. It is not a minor or peripheral system. It is fundamental to the maintenance of homeostasis, the body's ability to keep itself in balance. And for 50 years, while this system was quietly operating in the bodies of every human being on Earth, that the governments of the world had been classifying the external compound that interacted most directly with it as having no medical value, as having no accepted therapeutic use, as being, by the logic of law and the weight of official pronouncement, simply a menace. The irony is almost too large to hold. Emperor Shen Nung, in 2737 BCE, prescribed cannabis for rheumatism and gout, conditions we now understand to involve chronic inflammation, regulated in part by the endocannabinoid system. He did not know what the endocannabinoid system was. He could not have known, but he had observed, over years of careful attention, that the plant helped. The body he was prescribing it for responded because the body already had a system in place to receive what the plant was offering. The ancient pharmacopoeias of China and India were not magical or mystical. They were empirical. They worked because the biology was real, even before anyone had the tools to see it. The Scythians who threw hemp seeds on heated stones and breathed the smoke in their felt-lined chambers were activating the same receptors that Alan Howlett would identify in a laboratory 2,500 years later. Sir Russell Reynolds, writing in The Lancet in 1890 about 30 years of clinical experience with cannabis, was observing the endocannabinoid system at work without knowing the system had a name. Every physician who had ever prescribed a cannabis tincture for pain or spasm or anxiety had been, without the vocabulary to describe it precisely, working with a biological system that the human body had spent millions of years developing. And Harry Anslinger had looked at all of that, the ancient knowledge, the clinical record, the amber bottles, the quiet pharmacy shelves, and decided that it was less important than his budget. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because even before McCollum identified the endocannabinoid system, even before the CB1 receptor was named, someone had tried to tell the truth. And it is important, it is deeply, painfully important, to understand that the truth had been told, clearly and officially, long before anyone was ready to hear it. The year was 1944. Harry Anslinger was still running the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The Marijuana Tax Act was 7 years old. The propaganda of the Reefer Madness era was still reverberating through American culture. And in New York City, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, a man who had publicly doubted the claims being made about cannabis since the 1930s, had commissioned the first comprehensive scientific study of cannabis and its effects ever conducted in the United States. The LaGuardia Committee was assembled from the most qualified scientists and physicians available, researchers from the New York Academy of Medicine, pharmacologists, sociologists, clinical physicians. They studied cannabis systematically, rigorously, and without the predetermined conclusion that Anslinger had brought to his gore files. They administered cannabis to volunteers under controlled conditions. They studied its effects on behavior, on cognition, on physical health, on the social patterns of cannabis users in New York City. They took 5 years to complete their work. Their findings were published in 1944 under the title The Marijuana Problem in the City of New York, contradicted virtually every claim that Anslinger had made and every association that Reefer Madness had burned into the public imagination. Cannabis, the committee found, did not produce violent behavior. It did not cause psychosis in people who had no prior history of mental illness. It was not a gateway to harder drugs in the mechanical, inevitable way the propaganda had suggested. Its users were not the degenerate criminals of Anslinger's gore files, but ordinary people whose cannabis use was, in the committee's assessment, a habitual practice comparable in social function to alcohol consumption and significantly less damaging in its effects on physical health and behavior. The report was thorough, the report was honest, and the report was based on actual evidence. Anslinger denounced it. He attacked the methodology, the researchers, the mayor who had commissioned it, the institution that had published it. He used his influence to ensure that it was dismissed, discredited, and buried, that it did not penetrate the official consensus he had spent a decade building. He wrote to the editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, demanding that the journal refuse to review or discuss the committee's findings. The report was buried, and the lie continued, undisturbed, for another 3 decades. In 1988, the same year that Alan Howlett identified the CB1 receptor, something else happened that history has largely failed to remember, though it deserves to be remembered with the same weight as the Ehrlichman Confession. On the Drug Enforcement Administration, the agency that had inherited Anslinger's legacy, the modern incarnation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, had been petitioned to reclassify cannabis from Schedule 1. The petition had been filed by patient advocacy groups and medical organizations, and the DEA had been resisting it for years, But the law required that such petitions receive a formal hearing, and so a hearing was held. A DEA administrative law judge, a man named Francis Young, whose job it was to evaluate evidence impartially and render a legal judgment, presided over months of testimony from physicians, researchers, patients, and pharmacologists. Judge Young considered everything. He reviewed the medical literature. He heard from scientists. He took seriously the testimony of patients whose conditions had responded to cannabis when nothing else had worked. Patients with multiple sclerosis, with chronic pain, with the nausea and wasting caused by chemotherapy and by the emerging AIDS crisis. Patients for whom cannabis was not a recreational preference, but a medical lifeline. He applied the legal standard that the Controlled Substances Act required for Schedule I classification: no accepted medical use, high potential for abuse. And then he wrote his ruling. Marijuana, he wrote, and the use of the government's preferred term in a ruling that contradicted the government's preferred position has its own particular weight. In its natural form, is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. He concluded that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated accepted medical uses. He recommended that cannabis be reclassified to Schedule II, a category that would allow for medical prescription, allow for pharmaceutical research, allow for the kind of systematic clinical investigation that the Schedule I classification had made nearly impossible for 50 years. The DEA refused to implement the ruling, not on evidentiary grounds, on procedural ones. The agency that had been petitioned, whose own administrative law judge had ruled against it, simply declined to comply. The ruling gathered dust. The classification remained. The patients who had testified continued to need what the law continued to deny them. But science does not wait for permission, and the endocannabinoid system, once discovered, could not be undiscovered. The research that had been suppressed for 50 years began to escape into the world through the cracks that the system's defenders could no longer fully seal. Studies began to accumulate. Careful, peer-reviewed, published in reputable journals that couldn't be dismissed the way Anslinger had dismissed the LaGuardia report. Research into cannabis and epilepsy, the condition that O'Shaughnessy had treated with such remarkable results in 1839, the condition that had driven desperate parents to petition governments for access to cannabis medicines for their seizing children, produced results that were, in the word that serious scientists use when they mean something they were not expecting, striking. A compound derived from cannabis, cannabidiol, CBD, in the non-psychoactive sibling of THC, was found to reduce the frequency and severity of seizures in forms of childhood epilepsy that had resisted every other available treatment. Research into cannabis and chronic pain, the vast, poorly managed landscape of suffering that consumes an enormous proportion of healthcare resources in the developed world and drives a substantial portion of opioid prescribing and opioid addiction, found consistent evidence of benefit. The endocannabinoid system's role in pain modulation, once understood, made the mechanism clear. Cannabis compounds were interacting with a system that the body had built, in part, precisely for the management of pain signals. The ancient physicians had been right. The biology explained why. Research into cannabis and the specific suffering of cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy. The nausea so severe that patients sometimes chose to stop treatment rather than continue enduring it. The loss of appetite that produced dangerous wasting, the anxiety and sleeplessness that attended a diagnosis whose weight no one who has not received it can fully imagine. found that cannabis offered relief where other antiemetics and appetite stimulants fell short. The DEA's own administrative law judge had heard this testimony in 1988. The patients giving it had not been lying. Research into post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition affecting veterans, survivors of violence, people who had lived through experiences that the mind could not process cleanly and safely, found evidence that the endocannabinoid system played a role in the consolidation and extinction of fear memories, and that cannabis compounds could, in some patients, interrupt the cycle of intrusive memory and hyperarousal that defined the condition's cruelty. Soldiers who had come home from wars carrying wounds that did not show on X-rays were finding, in some cases, that the plant helped in ways that the pharmaceutical options did not. None of this was magic. None of it was the inflated claim of advocates who wanted a particular answer and had decided to ignore the evidence that complicated it. The science was careful, and it was qualified, and it acknowledged, as honest science always does, the things it did not yet know, and the questions it could not yet answer, the complexity of a plant that contained hundreds of active compounds interacting with a biological system of considerable intricacy. But it was real, and it was growing, and the wall of official denial was developing in the language of structural engineering, the kind of cracks that precede a collapse. California was the first American state to legalize medical cannabis in 1996. The vote was not close. Proposition 215 passed with 56% of the vote. Not a squeaker, not a narrow victory achieved against fierce popular resistance, but a clear expression of what a public, given the opportunity to assess the available evidence without the mediating influence of a federal bureau's propaganda, actually thought about the matter. Other states followed, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Colorado. The medical programs came first, careful, restricted, requiring physician authorization, confined to specific qualifying conditions. Then the broader legalization measures, state by state, each one requiring its advocates to make the argument in public, to assemble the evidence, to stand in front of skeptical audiences and say, "We have been told a story about this plant for 80 years, and the story was not true." It is worth noting that, as of the time of this telling, cannabis remains a Schedule I controlled substance under federal law in the United States. It remains, officially, a substance with no accepted medical value. It remains, in the eyes of federal law, in the same category as heroin. The DEA has declined to reclassify it despite the accumulating evidence, and despite the rulings of its own administrative judges, despite the medical programs operating legally in the majority of American states, despite the findings of the endocannabinoid system, despite everything. The machine does not yield easily. Machines built for a purpose tend to continue running long after the purpose has been discredited, because the machine itself has become the purpose, the jobs it provides, the budgets it justifies, the institutional identities it sustains. But the science does not care about the machine's momentum. The science continues. The endocannabinoid system continues to operate in every human body, every day, as it has operated for millions of years. The receptors continue to exist. The anandamide, the bliss molecule, the joy molecule, the molecule the body makes for itself, continues to flow. And the plant that interacts with all of it, the plant that the first farmers of Central Asia recognized and cultivated 12,000 years ago, the plant whose seeds were pressed into Neolithic pottery and whose fibers were woven into the fabric of the earliest civilizations, the plant prescribed by Shen Nung and documented by Herodotus and tested by O'Shaughnessy and endorsed by Reynolds and defended by the AMA and buried by Anslinger and imprisoned by Nixon, and being slowly, carefully, incompletely reclaimed by science and by law. That plant has not changed. It was never the villain. It was always just a plant. And the body knew it all along. There is a tomb in the Altai Mountains. It is more than 2,000 years old, a burial site from the Scythian era, excavated by archaeologists who were looking, as archaeologists always are, for the material record of a vanished life. What they found inside was what the Scythians always placed beside their dead, the objects that had mattered in life, the tools and vessels that a person might need in whatever comes after. Weapons, vessels of gold, the bones of sacrificed horses, and cannabis, seeds preserved in the cold, dry air of the mountain tomb, still recognizable after 2 millennia as exactly what they were, placed beside the dead with the same deliberateness as the gold, not hidden, not apologized for, placed there as a comfort or a provision or a final acknowledgement of a relationship between the living and this plant that the living had decided should accompany them even into the dark. The earth kept them. 2,000 years of cold and silence, and the seeds were still there, each waiting to be found by people who would need several more decades to understand fully what they were looking at. That patience, the patience of the earth, the patience of a plant that has been growing alongside human beings for 12,000 years and has survived everything we have subjected it to, including our fear of it, is perhaps the most important thing to carry with you as this night comes to its close. We began this evening in a pharmacy in London in 1895. An amber bottle on a polished wooden shelf, a mother lifting it down without a second thought, a physician who had prescribed it, a queen who had taken it quietly in the privacy of her suffering and found relief. The medicine unremarkable in its ordinariness, its presence on the shelf as natural and uncontroversial as aspirin, as undramatic as the cough syrup beside it. We traced that bottle back through centuries, through the Victorian pharmacies and the Irish physician standing on a dock in Calcutta, through the formal endorsements of the most distinguished medical journals in the English-speaking world, through the 30 years of careful clinical observation that Sir Russell Reynolds summarized in The Lancet, with the measured confidence of a man who simply reported what he had seen. We traced it back through the pharmacopoeias of the Arabic world and the medical papyri of ancient Egypt, through the Scythian burial chambers and the observations of Herodotus, through the imperial courts of China and the legendary figure of Shen Nung standing at the beginning of a medical tradition so old that its origins disappear into the mists of time that precede written record. And we watched the bottle shatter in the hands of Harry Anslinger, a man who needed a villain and built one from a word, from a fear, from the racial anxieties of a country in economic crisis. We watched the propaganda machine assemble itself, the Gore files, the Reefer Madness films, the congressional testimony built on the opinion of one cooperative doctor out of 30, the deliberate replacement of a medical name with a foreign one chosen for the fear it would invoke. We watched Samuel Caldwell sentenced to 4 years of hard labor on the day the law was signed for 2 cigarettes. We watched Dr. William Woodward stand up in a congressional hearing and speak the truth clearly and carefully, and be told, in essence, to sit down. We watched the machine grow. We watched Nixon declare a war whose own architects would later admit, or in plain language, was built on lies. We watched the numbers climb. 300,000 incarcerated in 1971, rising to 2,300,000 over the following decades, two-thirds of them people of color, arrested at rates 6 times higher than their white counterparts for behavior that was statistically identical. We watched Billie Holiday die handcuffed to a hospital bed with a federal agent outside her door. And then we watched the science arrive, quietly, patiently, in laboratories in Jerusalem and California and New York, and begin to say what the ancient world had always known, that the human body contains a system built to interact with this plant, that the endocannabinoid system operates in every one of us every day, regulating pain and mood and memory and the body's response to stress, that the cannabis plant, whatever governments had declared about it, was interacting with a biological reality that no declaration could alter. And now we are here, in the present, which is, in its own way, the strangest chapter of the story. Because the present is a place of profound contradiction, a place where the same plant can be sold legally in a glass dispensary in Colorado and result in a life sentence in Louisiana. A place where a corporation can patent a cannabis-derived pharmaceutical and sell it for thousands of dollars a month, while the man who grew the plant from which it was derived sits in a prison cell. A place where the medical establishment that once defended cannabis, then abandoned it, is now quietly, carefully returning to it, publishing studies, convening conferences, and are training physicians in the clinical application of cannabinoid medicine, rebuilding with great deliberateness the knowledge base that was deliberately destroyed. It is a strange kind of progress, halting, uneven, distributed so unevenly across lines of race and income and geography that it would be dishonest to call it justice. Because justice would look different from this. Justice would not require a woman to remain in a Louisiana prison for a cannabis offense, while the dispensary down the street from the courthouse that sentenced her sells the same product legally and taxes the profit. Justice would not require a community that bore the full weight of the war on drugs, that watched its fathers and brothers and sons disappear into the prison system for decades, to now watch the commercialization of the very substance for which they were imprisoned, with minimal participation and minimal benefit, flowing to the communities that paid the price. Justice would mean that the reckoning was complete, that the debt had been acknowledged and was being repaid, that the machine had been not merely slowed but dismantled. The machine has not been dismantled. It has been partially reformed, partially redirected, partially humanized at its edges, but its foundations, the racial disparity, the federal classification, the outstanding sentences and the outstanding records of the people who served those sentences and now live with their consequences, those foundations remain. That is worth sitting with. Not in anger, necessarily, though anger is a reasonable response, and this is not a night on which anyone should be told how to feel, but with the kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement that comes from understanding a thing completely, from following its history all the way to its roots and refusing to look away from what you find there. There are seeds in that Altai tomb that are 2,000 years old. There are seeds in museum archives from Chinese excavations that are older still. There are hemp fiber imprints pressed into Neolithic pottery from the Yangshao culture that are 5,000 years old. the accidental record of a plant so thoroughly woven into daily human life that it left its impression on the clay that people use to carry water. The earth has a long memory, longer than any government, longer than any prohibition, longer than any propaganda campaign, however well funded and however ruthlessly maintained. The plant has been growing alongside human beings since before we had writing to record our relationship with it, since before we had law to regulate it, since before we had the concept of a state to declare it an enemy. It was here before all of that, and it has, with the patient indifference of the natural world, continued to be here through all of it. This is not, to be clear, as a romantic argument for the plant's inevitability or its right to exist free from any regulation. The medical and legal questions surrounding cannabis are genuinely complex, and the answers to them require the kind of careful, evidence-based thinking that the propaganda era specifically made impossible. The endocannabinoid system exists, and the therapeutic applications of cannabis compounds are real, and the science that is now accumulating is serious and rigorous. But science is also honest about what it does not yet know, and there is a great deal it does not yet know about the long-term effects of different consumption methods, about the specific risks associated with adolescent use, about the optimal therapeutic applications of different cannabinoid profiles for different conditions. These are questions that deserve careful answers. They are the questions that 50 years of Schedule I classification made it nearly impossible to ask properly. What the history asks of us, the history we have traced together through this long night, is something more fundamental than a position on legalization. It asks that we look honestly at the machinery of how decisions about dangerous substances are actually made in the modern world, that we recognize the distance between the stated justifications and the actual motivations, that we understand that the classification of a substance as criminal has, throughout this particular history, had almost nothing to do with the substance's actual properties and almost everything to do with the people associated with its use. Harry Anslinger did not criminalize cannabis because he had evaluated the evidence and found it damning. He criminalized it because he needed a budget and found a scapegoat. Nixon did not declare war on drugs because the drugs were winning. He declared war on the people the drugs could be associated with, and the drugs were the mechanism. John Ehrlichman said so, out loud, 22 years after the fact, and 16 years before the world was ready to read it. But he said it. The medical renaissance is real, and it is worth marking, even in the measured register, that this particular hour of the night requires. In country after country, in state after state, in the journals and the clinical trials and the hospital wards, where physicians are learning again what their predecessors in the 19th century knew without the benefit of molecular biology to explain it. Cannabis is being reassessed. The reassessment is cautious, and it is qualified, and it is proceeding with the deliberateness of institutions that understand they are reversing a 50-year consensus and do not wish to be seen to be doing so carelessly. Children with certain forms of severe, treatment-resistant epilepsy are receiving cannabis-derived medications and experiencing, in some cases, reductions in seizure frequency that have brought their families to tears. Families who spent years watching their children suffer through dozens of seizures a day, while the federal government classified the compound that might have helped as medically valueless. Veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder are finding in some cases that the endocannabinoid system responds to cannabis in ways that allow the body to process what it could not process before, to quiet the alarm that would not stop sounding, or patients with chronic pain, with multiple sclerosis, with the specific suffering of late-stage cancer. They are finding something, not a cure, not magic, but something real, something measurable, something that interacts with their biology in ways that the ancient physicians observed and the modern machine suppressed. The ancient physicians did not know about the endocannabinoid system. They did not know about CB1 receptors or anandamide or the molecular geometry of THC. But they knew what they saw. They saw the plant help people. They recorded what they saw, carefully and honestly, in the pharmacopoeias and the medical texts and the clinical observations that accumulated over thousands of years into one of the most thoroughly documented therapeutic traditions in human history. What we have spent the last century doing, with enormous effort and at enormous cost, is not so much discovering that they were right as remembering it. The night is late now, and there is a particular quality to the silence of very late nights, a quality that anyone who has ever lain awake in the small hours will recognize, a quality that is part stillness and part the awareness of how long the world has been here before us and how long it will be here after. Somewhere in a Xinjiang province in northwestern China, there are farmers growing cannabis in the same soil where their ancestors grew it 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, back and back through the long corridor of time to the first farmers of the Neolithic who noticed this plant growing at the edges of their settlements and decided, and with the practical wisdom of people who could not afford to waste anything useful, to cultivate it. Somewhere in Colorado, a dispensary opens its doors in the morning with the matter-of-fact confidence of a business that has decided it is simply a business, selling a product that people want, paying its taxes, operating within its license conditions, unremarkable in its ordinariness. 3 states away, in a federal prison, a man is beginning another day of a sentence that was imposed for the possession of this same product. Somewhere in a laboratory in Israel, a researcher who trained under Raphael Mechoulam is conducting a trial, careful, blinded, peer-reviewed, the way careful science is conducted, into the application of cannabidiol for a condition that has not yet yielded to the available pharmaceutical options. Now, the results will take years to arrive, and they will be qualified when they do, and they will require replication, and they will contribute incrementally to a body of knowledge that is still, after 50 years of suppression, being rebuilt. And somewhere, in a museum archive, in a university collection, in the kind of carefully maintained quiet that is the custodian of the things the world has decided to keep, there are seeds, pressed into the clay of ancient pottery, preserved in the cold of mountain tombs, the material memory of a relationship between our species and this plant that is older than writing, older than law, older than the concept of the state, that decided one morning in 1937 that the relationship was a crime. The earth kept them. The earth keeps everything in the end. And perhaps that is the thought with which this night should close. Not with resolution exactly, because the story is not resolved. The people still in prison are still in prison. The federal classification still stands. The machine is still running, slower now, more contested, its legitimacy more openly questioned than at any point since its construction, but still running. The resolution is not here yet, but with something quieter than resolution, with the recognition that the history of this plant, the full, unedited, 10,000-year history that we have traced together through these long hours, contains within it something more durable than the policies that have been built around it. That the relationship between the human body and this plant is older than any law. That the endocannabinoid system does not check the Federal Register before it operates. That the seeds preserved in Scythian burial chambers do not know that they have been classified as Schedule 1. The earth has a long memory, longer than Harry Anslinger, longer than the Marijuana Tax Act, longer than the war on drugs, longer than all the machinery of fear and budget and racial animus that was assembled over a century to make the world afraid of something that 10,000 years of human experience had found worthy not of fear but of care. The plant has been here through all of it. It will be here when the last prison sentence for cannabis possession has been served, and the last file has been closed, and the last piece of the machine has been dismantled or quietly allowed to rust. It was never the villain of this story, and the villain was something much older and much more familiar. The human willingness to take what is ordinary, name it something frightening, and build a machine of suffering around the name. That is the lesson the history offers. Not about cannabis exactly, about us. About the distance between what we tell ourselves we are doing and what we are actually doing. About the ease with which fear can be manufactured and the difficulty with which it can be unmade. About what it costs in decades and in lives and in the specific irreplaceable weight of individual human suffering. When the machinery of government is turned against the truth. The amber bottle stood on the pharmacy shelf for a century before anyone decided to be afraid of it. It can stand there again. Good night.